War is a meat grinder claiming millions of lives, but the paradox of history is that this very catastrophe gave us the medicine we use today. Is it true that soldiers smoked and joked right on the operating table while surgeons performed complex abdominal operations? And how did ordinary mold, scraped by scientists from basement walls, become a strategic weapon? Right now, we will see how people in white coats won their own war, the war against death. War is always destruction, pain, and death. But paradoxically, it is in the conditions of global conflicts that medicine makes its most rapid and significant leaps. History shows that the need to save thousands of wounded here and now, in the mud of trenches and under the roar of cannonade, forces doctors and scientists to act with incredible speed and determination. What would take decades of laboratory research, approvals, and clinical trials in peacetime is implemented in war in a matter of months and sometimes weeks. World War II became the brightest example of this phenomenon. It was this war that turned penicillin and other revolutionary discoveries from theoretical experiments into real ammunition that saved millions of lives. The contrast between what medicine could offer in the early 20th century and what it had at its disposal by 1945 is striking. Even in World War I, any serious injury meant either death from sepsis or severe disability after amputation, with a high degree of probability. Infection was as terrible an enemy as the enemy's bullet. However, by the end of World War II, the situation had changed radically. The appearance of antibiotics, new methods of wound treatment, and the systematic organization of aid allowed up to 70% of the wounded to return to duty, which previously seemed like science fiction. Doctors at the front wage their own war. Their opponent is not an enemy soldier, but time and death itself. In conditions of shortage of everything, from bandages to clean water, medics are forced to improvise, look for non-standard solutions, and take risks. It is this race against death, where the stake is a human life, that gives birth to unexpectedly bold and effective methods. Surgeons, therapists, and epidemiologists, working at the limit of human capabilities, do not just treat, they create new medicine, the legacy of which we use to this day. Medical breakthroughs of the World War II era did not arise from nothing. They relied on a foundation laid during previous major conflicts, each of which brought its bitter lessons and important discoveries. The history of military medicine can be viewed as the evolution of rescue methods, where every step was paid for with blood. The beginning of modern field surgery was laid back in the mid-19th century during the Crimean War. The outstanding surgeon Nikolai Pirogov first introduced the concept of medical triage, dividing the wounded into those who need immediate help, those who can wait, and the hopeless. He also began the massive use of ether anesthesia in field conditions and plaster casts for fixing fractures, which saved thousands of limbs from amputation. These principles, triage and fixation, became the ABCs of military medicine. World War I brought new challenges and new solutions. The scale of hostilities and the nature of wounds, shrapnel, lacerations, contusions, required the development of evacuation and diagnostic methods. Sanitary trains and automobiles appeared, and X-ray machines began to be used closer to the front line. The first mass blood transfusions began, although methods for its preservation were still imperfect. However, despite the progress, mortality from wound infections and shock remained catastrophically high. Gangrene and sepsis took the lives of even those who successfully survived the operation. The real revolution began in 1928, when Alexander Fleming accidentally noticed the bactericidal effect of the mold Penicillium notatum. This discovery, which would later turn the world upside down, was initially perceived by the scientific community without enthusiasm. For several years, the effect of penicillin was considered more of a curious laboratory curiosity than the basis for a medicine. Technologies for isolating the pure substance and stabilizing it simply did not exist. A little known but indicative fact of that time illustrates how far from reality the mass use of antibiotics seemed. Early penicillin was so expensive, scarce, and quickly excreted from the body that during the first clinical experiments, doctors were forced to collect the urine of patients receiving the drug, purify penicillin from it, and re-inject it. It sounded almost like despair. But this is how, step by step, science moved towards the understanding that humanity could have a powerful weapon against invisible killers, bacteria. By the beginning of World War II, the potential had been accumulated, but the trigger for mass production had not yet been pulled. World War II became not just a continuation of previous conflicts, but a gigantic, cruel testing ground where medicine became an integral part of military strategy. The sharp increase in the firepower of armies led to a monstrous number of severe injuries, and the command of all warring parties quickly realized a simple truth. Victory depends not only on how many soldiers you can mobilize, but also on how many of them you can return to duty after injury. Medicine ceased to be just a humanitarian mission. It became a factor of combat capability. The front turned into a huge laboratory where not only people but also organizational systems were tested for strength. A clear echelon system of medical care was built. It began right in the trench, where a sanitary instructor applied a tourniquet and a bandage, continued in medical companies and battalions, where primary surgical debridement was carried out, and ended in rear hospitals, where complex reconstructive operations were performed. Speed became the key element. The golden hour rule, although the term itself would appear later, became a de facto law. The faster the wounded got to the surgeon's table, the higher were his chances. Special attention was paid to triage, medical sorting. Facing a massive influx of casualties, doctors had to instantly make cruel but necessary decisions. Whom to operate on immediately to save a life, whom to send to the rear without urgent intervention, and on whom, alas, it was already pointless to waste precious time and resources. This cold logic saved thousands of lives, allowing efforts to be concentrated where they were most effective. The war also became a catalyst for the merger of surgery and pharmacology. If earlier a surgeon relied only on a scalpel, now powerful chemical allies appeared in his arsenal. The active introduction of sulfonamides, streptocide and its derivatives, allowed infection to be suppressed even before the operation or during transport. Anesthesia methods improved, which made it possible to perform longer and more complex interventions. The first comprehensive protocols for treating traumatic shock and replenishing massive blood loss were developed, which was previously considered almost a death sentence. A grim but accurate joke circulated among frontline surgeons. They operate at the pace of artillery shelling. The flow of wounded was so dense that doctors did not leave the tables for days. In this mode, any trifle, any new technique that allowed saving 5 minutes or reducing the risk of suppuration was instantly picked up, tested by practice, and became the norm for all field surgery. War did not forgive mistakes and conservatism, forcing medicine to evolve at incredible speed. If we look for a symbol of the medical triumph of World War II, it will undoubtedly be penicillin. This substance became the very silver bullet that struck the soldiers' eternal enemies: purulent infection, sepsis, and gas gangrene. The history of turning laboratory mold into a mass drug is a real scientific detective story and a feat. In the early 1940s, when the war was already blazing in Europe, a group of British scientists from Oxford, led by Howard Florey and Ernst Chain, was able to solve a problem that proved too tough for Fleming himself. They found a way to purify and stabilize penicillin. However, there were no resources for industrial production in bomb-ravaged Britain. The technology was transferred to the USA, where it was declared a priority military project. American industry performed a miracle. If in 1941 there was enough penicillin to treat only a few individuals, then by the Normandy landings in 1944, the Allied armies had billions of units of the drug at their disposal. The effect was stunning. Mortality from infections dropped to a historical minimum, and amputations, previously inevitable in severe limb injuries, began to be performed much less frequently. The Soviet Union, isolated from Western penicillin production technologies, went its own way. In the conditions of the fiercest war, Soviet microbiologists performed their own scientific feat. Professor Zinaida Ermolieva, an outstanding scientist and a person of legendary courage, isolated her own strain of the fungus Penicillium crustosum in 1942, which turned out to be even more productive than the Anglo-American one. Based on it, the first Soviet antibiotic, crustosine, was created. Parallel to her, Georgy Gauss and Maria Brajnikova worked, isolating another powerful antibiotic, Gramicidin S, from soil bacteria in 1942, which was effectively used to treat infected wounds locally. The personality of Zinaida Ermolieva deserves special mention. In her youth, even before the war, she actually committed an act worthy of a movie plot. To prove her hypotheses about the roots of cholera spread and the effectiveness of water chlorination, she intentionally infected herself with cholera and almost died, but survived and proved she was right. During the war, her authority was undeniable. There is a persistent story, often retold as a legend, but having grounds. Having received the Stalin Prize for the creation of penicillin, Ermolieva donated the entire amount to the Defense Fund for the construction of a fighter plane, which was named Zinaida Ermolieva. In the frontline memoirs of medics, one can find almost anecdotal but true details of those years. In search of the necessary mold strains, laboratory and hospital staff literally climbed through damp basements, bomb shelters, and collected samples from the walls. The mold hunt was conducted with the excitement of gold diggers. They scraped off any suspicious coating, hoping to find that very saving fungus. It sounds funny today, but back then it was a desperate race against death, where science was born literally from dirt and dampness to save lives. Surgery and antibiotics are always in the spotlight when it comes to military medicine. But invisible heroes, prevention, diagnostics, and the blood service, played no less important a role. Without them, losses from epidemics and exhaustion could have exceeded combat losses, as often happened in past wars. In conditions of the front and rear, where millions of people lived in overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, cold, and without normal food, the threat of epidemics was colossal. Typhus, dysentery, cholera, tularemia, these horsemen of the apocalypse always accompanied armies. Soviet and Allied doctors deployed a system of anti-epidemic protection unprecedented in scale. Vaccination became total. New vaccines were developed and introduced, for example, against typhus, and phages against dysentery and cholera were created. Sanitary epidemiological detachments, bath laundry trains, disinfection chambers, worked as intensively as combat units. Strict sanitary regime was maintained even in the frontline zone, which allowed preventing mass outbreaks of diseases that could paralyze the front. Diagnostics took a huge step forward. X-ray machines became more compact and mobile, which allowed them to be used not only in the deep rear, but also in field hospitals to search for shrapnel and assess fractures. Fluorography acquired special importance in the fight against tuberculosis, the scourge of wartime. Thanks to early detection and a systematic approach to treatment, by the end of the war in a number of countries, including the USSR, mortality from tuberculosis was reduced even below pre-war levels, which was a real miracle of social medicine. Blood became a strategic resource no less important than oil. A powerful blood service was created. Transfusion stations worked around the clock, collecting tons of donor blood from the civilian population. Preservation and transportation technologies developed, allowing blood to be delivered to the front line. But there was always a shortage of donor blood, and this spurred the development of blood substitutes. Soviet scientists created a number of saline and colloidal solutions, which, although they could not completely replace blood, allowed maintaining pressure and saving the wounded with massive blood loss until a full transfusion. A little known but important detail is the history of the synthesis in the USSR of the drug Vikasol, a water-soluble analog of vitamin K. This drug, which accelerates blood clotting, became an indispensable tool for stopping bleeding in the wounded, especially during abdominal operations and liver injuries. Vikasol is still in the arsenal of doctors today, remaining a living reminder of how military necessity gave birth to medicines that became classics of medicine. War radically changed the very philosophy of surgical intervention. If earlier a surgeon strove to sew up a wound tightly immediately after treatment, the experience of World War II showed the fallacy of this approach in conditions of high risk of infection. A tactic was born that saved thousands of lives: primary surgical debridement, removal of dead tissue and foreign bodies, leaving the wound open for drainage, and only then, after a few days, applying secondary sutures. Combined with the use of antiseptics and later antibiotics, this dramatically reduced the number of complications such as anaerobic infection. One of the main problems of field surgery was pain. General anesthesia, ether or chloroform, required bulky equipment, time, and qualified anesthesiologists, who were always in short supply. The solution was the widespread introduction of local and conduction anesthesia. The great surgeon Alexander Vishnevsky developed the method of creeping infiltrate, layer-by-layer injection of a weak Novocaine solution, which turned off nerve endings in the operation zone. This allowed performing the most complex interventions even on the organs of the chest and abdominal cavity, without general anesthesia. Novocaine blockades also became a powerful means of combating traumatic shock, interrupting the flow of pain impulses to the brain. Huge progress was achieved in reconstructive surgery. The war gave surgeons a sad but rich experience in treating severe traumatic brain injuries, spinal and facial injuries, It was in the hospitals of World War II that many methods of modern plastic surgery and neurosurgery were born. Doctors learned to restore shattered jaws, transplant skin, and suture nerves. The Filatov flap, a method of skin grafting, became a salvation for burned tankers and pilots. In the memoirs of surgeons, one often finds a description of the atmosphere in the operating rooms of those years, which today may shock. Thanks to Vishnevsky's local anesthesia, patients remained conscious during the operation. Doctors recalled how wounded soldiers, lying on the table with a cut-open stomach or chest, could talk to the surgeon, joke, and even smoke, which was not strictly forbidden then. This happened not because of a good life, but because the alternative was either fatal pain shock or dangerous and inaccessible deep anesthesia. Such scenes are a vivid illustration of how medicine adapted to extreme conditions, finding the line between the possible and the impossible. When the guns finally fell silent, the world inherited not only ruins and scars, but also a colossal baggage of medical knowledge paid for at a high price. Medical breakthroughs born in the fire of World War II did not disappear with it, but became the foundation of the modern civilian healthcare system. What was an emergency measure at the front turned into the gold standard of peacetime. Antibiotics, which began their journey as a precious medicine for the elect, became available in every pharmacy, forever changing the treatment of infectious diseases. Pneumonia, sore throat, sepsis ceased to be death sentences. The principles of primary surgical debridement of wounds, methods of treating fractures, burns, and shock, worked out on millions of wounded, formed the basis of modern traumatology and disaster surgery. The ambulance and staged evacuation system, when a patient is stabilized on the spot and taken to a specialized center, is a direct legacy of the military medical doctrine of those years. Many drugs created or improved during the war, from antibiotics and sulfonamides to blood substitutes and blood clotting agents, the same Vicosol, continue to save lives today, albeit in the form of more modern analogs. Technologies for blood transfusion and storage, mass vaccination, methods of rehabilitation for the disabled, all this came from military hospitals. The conclusion from this history is paradoxical and tragic. War is undoubtedly a monstrous evil, bringing untold suffering. But it is in its grim shadow that medicine learned to save people as effectively as never before. The benefit for subsequent generations turned out to be colossal, but the ethical question remains open. Does humanity really need a global catastrophe to mobilize resources for such a powerful leap in science and humanism? Is it possible to achieve the same pace of progress without bloody sacrifices? The emotional point in this reflection is best put by a thought that often sounds in the diaries and memoirs of military doctors. We worked to exhaustion, dreaming of the day when our knowledge would not be needed by anyone at the front. But deep down, we were very afraid that without this front, without this terrible necessity, this knowledge saving millions today would never have been born at all. Share your thoughts below, like for the work of doctors of that era, and subscribe to the channel. Take care of yourself, and may this medical knowledge never be useful to you in combat conditions. See you.